think, oh, hello. I think they're going to use this one. Okay. Can I get everyone's attention, please? Oh, fantastic. What a well-behaved congregation you have, Adam. All right. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to St Hilary's Forum on the Referendum. Firstly, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we are gathered here today. I pay respect to the elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. If we have yet to meet, my name is Amy Leong, and I am honoured to be your MC for this evening. Now, you may not have seen me before, so I'll just quickly introduce myself. I am actually a lawyer by trade, and also am a Maxwell Leadership Certified Coach, Speaker, Trainer, and I am passionate about equipping lawyers, churches and workplaces to have sustainable success and leadership principles so that they can burn bright and not out. I practice in the areas of property and commercial law at Hutchinson Legal in Ringwood, and I've also emceed a few events such as the Melbourne Prayer Breakfast, and that's kind of the reason why I'm here today. So one of the staff members here at St Hilary's reached out about 2 weeks ago, and I heard about how your church was really open to having a conversation about the referendum. So I was delighted to be here and part of this event tonight. Now, as most of you would know, the referendum concerning the Indigenous voice will be held on the 14th of October 2023. Australians will be asked to approve an alteration to the Australian Constitution that would create a body called the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice that may make representations to the Parliament and the Executive Government on matters relating to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders peoples. The forum this evening is an opportunity to learn more about the proposed changes to the Constitution, what the change is, why it has been proposed, and how it will operate in practice. The forum is a place for questions, discussion, and information. For clarity, this forum has not been organised by the Yes campaign, nor has it been organised by the No campaign. We expect that within the audience, and for those tuning online and via live stream or watching the replay, that there will be people who have decided to vote no, there will be some who have decided to vote yes, and then people who have yet to make up their mind. Everyone is welcome, and everyone is welcome to ask questions. We ask only that the discussion is respectful. So before we get into this discussion part of the evening, I would like to introduce you to two of the speakers who are sitting up here tonight, and then a brief outline of the order of proceedings. So tonight we'll be hearing from Mr. Tim Goodwin, who is a barrister practicing primarily in commercial and public law. Prior to joining the bar, Tim worked as a solicitor at Allens and was an associate at the Federal Court of Australia and the Constitutional Court of South Africa. Tim is a member of the Yuin people of the southeast coast of New South Wales. And I also asked Tim to share some fun facts about himself that I could share with you. He is an Anglican who also went to an all-boys Catholic high school. He has met the Dalai Lama, and he has represented an evangelical Protestant in a religious discrimination case once. So you can make of that what you will. We will also be hearing from the Honorary Justice Michael O'Brien, who was appointed as a judge to the Federal Court of Australia on the 26th of February 2019. He was also appointed to the Australian Competition Tribunal on the 12th of December 2019 and was appointed President on the 26th of March this year. Michael has been a member of St Hilary's since 1990 and is clearly someone who likes to put down deep roots. So how the rest of this evening will go ahead, we will have an opening prayer by the lead minister here, Adam, and he will then just share a few opening thoughts as well. Michael and Tim will then have about until 8:30, so I'll keep on time, to have an open conversation with us regarding what changes are proposed, and why it has been proposed, and how it will operate in practice. So if you do have any questions, while Michael and Tim are speaking. There will be a phone number, I believe, that will be flashed up on the screen right now. And so you can send those questions to that number, and then we'll have some time for Q&A at the end of the time that Tim and Michael will be speaking. So without further ado, I would like to invite Adam to the stage to open up this time in prayer.
Thanks very much. How great to see so many people here tonight, and I know there's a number of people online as well. Let me add my welcome to our presenters, Tim, Michael and Amy tonight, to visitors here and online as well. It's so wonderful to have you. You may have seen the editorial cartoon that's been doing the rounds. It shows on one side a board that says, don't know, vote no, and on the other side, don't know, find out. And I guess that's part of what we're here to do, you know, especially if we're people who are trying to learn more. I am one of them, to actually have an opportunity to find out tonight. That's our intent. My belief is that it's not my role as a pastor to provide counsel about things outside of my field of expertise. And so that's why I'm here to sit at the feet of people who understand these issues better than I do. However, some have asked me for a biblical perspective. Tonight is predominantly about hearing about the law and some history from people who are qualified to present on these matters. So rather than give you a biblical perspective, let me take just a moment to give you perhaps what I call a biblical framework that might be helpful for us tonight. We know that Christians can prayerfully and biblically consider matters and land in different places. And that's what we're inviting each of us into tonight. So here are 4 principles I think that are helpful to us tonight. The first one is truth-telling. In Ephesians 4, you read, "Instead, speaking the truth in love, we will grow to become in every respect the mature body of him who is the head, that is Christ. Therefore, each of you must put off falsehood and speak truthfully to your neighbour, for we are all members of one body." The second principle is justice seeking. And this is a very well-known verse from Micah 6. "He has shown you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God." The third principle is grace giving. Grace is a word that means free gift. And so in Matthew 10 we read, "As you go, proclaim the message. The kingdom of heaven has come near. Heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse those who have leprosy, drive out demons. Freely you have received, freely give." And the fourth principle is that of peacemaking. And again in Ephesians 4 we read, "Be completely humble and gentle, be patient, bearing with one another in love. Make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace." Whatever our position is or will be, I think as a church we should be willing and able to both faithfully commit to this framework and engage thoughtfully and respectfully, both this evening and in other opportunities we have out in our communities in which we live and work. So with all that in mind, let me pray as we open tonight's discussion. Gracious Father, thank you for gathering so many people tonight here in the room and online. Thank you that people's hearts are disposed to learn more and to grow in understanding. We pray each of us for wisdom as we approach the referendum next month. And we pray that this would be a really blessed and helpful time together tonight as we listen and learn and seek to follow you, Lord, in the best way that we know how. So we pray all these things this evening in Jesus' name. Amen.
Thanks, Matt. I'm hoping this will work. It does. Thank you. Well, can I add my welcome to everybody who's here this evening. It's so pleasing to see so many people here, and I understand a number of people online as well. And what's also most pleasing is many friends in the audience as well. It shows that I think many people, and obviously the people here, are engaged in this question that's going to be put to the referendum, and that is a really good thing to be so engaged. As Amy mentioned, the forum this evening is intended to enable questions, discussion and information about the referendum. 3 questions, all matters can be reduced to 3 questions: what, why and how. And so the questions that Tim and I are going to seek to answer are precisely those. The first question is what the change is. The second question is why has it been proposed? And the third question is how will it operate in practice? And I've agreed with Tim that I'm going to start with the easy question, which is what is the change? And Tim doesn't even need to ask me that question because I'll assume the question's been asked, and I'll proceed to answer that question. And then I'm going to ask Tim the harder questions about why the proposal and how will it work in practice. So if I can start with the first overhead, thank you. So on voting day, Australians are going to be asked quite a short question that'll appear on your paper. Do you approve a proposed alteration to the Constitution to recognise the First Peoples of Australia by establishing an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice? So that's the question that will appear on the paper to be answered yes or no. Can I go to the second question? Because it's important to understand what lies behind that question that's going to be on the ballot paper. So the actual constitutional amendment, the formal change that's being proposed, will be to create a new Chapter 9 of the Constitution, and I'm going to mention the other chapters in a moment, but this will create a new Chapter 9 of the Constitution. It'll have the title, Recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Peoples. And the new chapter will have a single section in the Constitution, section 129. It'll be the last section in the Constitution. Today there's 128 sections in the Constitution, give or take 1 or 2, because some have actually been removed over the years. But the section will state as follows, the new section 129. In recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders peoples as the first peoples of Australia, 1, there shall be a body to be called the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice. 2, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice may make representations to the Parliament and the Executive Government of the Commonwealth on matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And 3, the Parliament shall, subject to this Constitution, have power to make laws with respect to matters relating to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice, including its composition, its functions, its powers, and its procedures. Now, there are a number of important elements to that new section. And before saying something about each of the elements that are in that section, I want to introduce you briefly to the Australian Constitution. Not many people have met the Australian Constitution, and I'd hazard a guess that it is largely unknown to the majority of people in this room. You may know the Constitution was drafted in a series of conventions held in the 1890s, and they were attended by representatives of the colonies. Before the Constitution came into effect, its terms were approved by the people of New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia, Western Australia, Queensland and Tasmania. And the Constitution was then enacted as part of a British Act of Parliament in 1900, and it took effect on the 1st of January 1901. A British Act was necessary because before 1901, Australia was a collection of 6 self-governing British colonies, and ultimate power over those colonies rested with the British Parliament. The Constitution established a federal system of government, and it's for that reason that the establishment of the Commonwealth in 1901 is often referred to as federation, the date of federation. Under a federal system, powers are distributed between a central government and regional governments, and of course in Australia that there's a division of powers between the Commonwealth government and the 6 states. If I could go to the 3rd slide, thank you. The Constitution currently has 8 chapters. Don't fear, I'm not going to take you through those 8 chapters. But I did want to highlight this. You'll see the titles to each of the 8 chapters there. Chapters 1, 2 and 3 of the Constitution confer the legislative, executive and judicial powers of the Commonwealth on 3 different bodies, which are established by the Constitution. The Parliament in Chapter 1, the Executive Government in Chapter 2, and the Judicature, which is also known as the Courts, in Chapter 3. Legislative power is the power to make laws, and that's exercised by the Parliament. Executive power is the power to administer laws and carry out the business of government, and that's done through ministers, through government departments and through statutory authorities. And judicial power is the power to conclusively determine legal disputes between citizens, which includes the power to interpret and apply the Constitution and the laws made by Parliament under the Constitution. And the court that I sit on, the Federal Court, is created under those powers created by Chapter 3 of the Constitution. The Constitution is a high-level document. It doesn't contain details. It creates the framework for our democracy and establishes the institutions that are able to exercise power in our democracy. And I want to illustrate that point by referring to just a couple of the provisions in the Constitution. If I could go to the 4th overhead. So I've mentioned Chapter 1, the Parliament, and I've put up there Section 1 of Chapter 1, the very first provision that appears in our Constitution, and this is it. The legislative power of the Commonwealth shall be vested in a federal Parliament, which shall consist of the Queen, a Senate and a House of Representatives, and which is hereinafter called the Parliament or the Parliament of the Commonwealth. Now I put that up to illustrate the language and the style of the Constitution. There are a few other provisions in the Constitution dealing with the Parliament, but they're not much more detailed than that. That is the tenor of a Constitution in framing the institutions of our democracy. If I could go to the next overhead, let me just illustrate with one more provision, still within Chapter 1. So still dealing with Parliament, still dealing with the power to make laws, Commonwealth laws. Section 51 is a very important provision in the Constitution. It creates most of the legislative powers of our Commonwealth government and specifies those. And most of the heads of power stated in Section 51 are stated in very broad terms. So the provision reads, the Parliament shall, subject to this Constitution, have power to make laws for the peace, order and good government of the Commonwealth with respect to, I've just picked out a few quite random powers, except for one which is not random, but the first one is trade and commerce with other countries and among the states. I picked out 15 very randomly because it's weights and measures. I picked out 16 because it's equally random, bills of exchange and promissory notes. 17 is bankruptcy and insolvency, and 18 is copyrights, patents of inventions and designs and trademarks. But they are the fields of power that's given to the Commonwealth government. I've added 26 only because it is topical at the moment in the current environment. It's worth noting, Section 26 gives the Commonwealth power to make effectively special laws with respect to the people of any race. Before 1967, Aboriginal people were expressly excluded from that power. And therefore the Commonwealth Parliament had no power before then to make laws with respect to Aboriginal people. That was a power that lay with the states, had that power. One of the two changes made by the 1967 referendum was to remove that exclusion. The effect of that was to empower the Commonwealth Parliament to make laws with respect to Aboriginal people. The second change that was made by the 1967 referendum was to remove section 127 of our Constitution. That section previously provided that in reckoning the numbers of the people of the Commonwealth or of a state or other part of the Commonwealth, Aboriginal natives shall not be counted. And that was removed in 1967. If I could go to the next overhead, and this is the last provision of the Constitution I'll take you to. I just want to say something about Chapter 2, which concerns the executive government. So it's the second chapter of the Constitution. We see there's a chapter on the Parliament, there's a chapter on the executive government, there's a chapter on the judicature. And I've just, again, chosen rather randomly one section from within Chapter 2 of the Constitution, just to give you a flavour of the tenor of constitutional provisions. But Section 64 is concerned with ministers of state. And that provision simply states, it's headed Ministers of State, and it simply states the Governor-General may appoint officers to administer such departments of state of the Commonwealth as the Governor-General in Council may establish. Now, that is a very brief introduction to the Australian Constitution, but I hope it serves in that very short survey just to orientate you in relation to the proposed voice referendum. Gives you a better framework in which to understand what is this amendment that's being made and what the features of the amendment are. Could I go to the seventh overhead? So I've brought back an overhead I had earlier. This is the form of Section 129 because I wanted to make just a few remarks about it in light of what I've just discussed about the Constitution, and hopefully it's easier to understand the language of this proposed amendment, having had a little bit of a skip through the Constitution. So you'll see again, just reading it one more time, the provision in recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first peoples of Australia. 1, there shall be a body to be called the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice. 2, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice may make representations to the Parliament. You'll understand that's a reference to Chapter 1 of the Constitution, the body established by Chapter 1, and the Executive Government. And that's a reference to the institutions created under Chapter 2 of the Constitution, the Executive Government. Representations to the Parliament and the Executive Government of the Commonwealth on matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. 3, the Parliament shall, subject to this Constitution, have power to make laws. That will now be a familiar form of words to you. It's precisely the same form of words that commences Section 51 of the Constitution and indeed is found in other parts of the Constitution as well. But that's the type of language which is used to empower the Commonwealth Government to have the authority to make laws. The Parliament shall, subject to this Constitution, have power to make laws with respect to matters relating to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice, including its composition, functions, powers and procedures. Let me make just 4 or 5 brief observations about those words. The first, which you will have already picked up from what I've been saying, is the language, the style of the language of the amendment is in the style of the Constitution. That is constitutional language. It is high level. It is a framework provision. The Constitution is high level. It establishes frameworks. Second, the provision creates a body which is to be called the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice. Third, and I think it is a significant point, and you'll see it in the language, the body is being created in recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first peoples of Australia. That's how the provision begins, and that's its stated intention. And there is an important issue here which we can discuss in the general session when we come to general questions. And the issue concerns this aspect, that the recognition that is being afforded to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples by the proposed voice is not by reason of race, but by reason of indigeneity, by being the first peoples of this country. And there is a significant distinction, indeed recognised in international conventions, between race and indigeneity. It's relevant to note in that regard that Article 18 of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples states that Indigenous peoples have the right to participate in decision-making in matters which would affect their rights through representatives chosen by themselves in accordance with their own procedures, as well as to maintain and develop their own Indigenous decision-making institutions. The fourth observation I'd make just about the language is that the voice is given the right to make the representations to the Parliament and the executive government of the Commonwealth. As I've mentioned, in other words, institutions created by chapters 1 and 2 of the Constitution. And the representations that may be made are on matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, so on matters relating to themselves, consistent with the UN Declaration. And the fifth and final observation I'll make is that Parliament is empowered by the proposed provision to make laws with respect to the voice, including its composition, its functions, its powers and procedures. As in all other aspects of the Constitution, the detail is left to Parliament to determine by the laws that it enacts. That's all I wanted to say on the what, and to try and paint something of the background of the what. As I mentioned at the beginning, the what is in many respects the easy question, and that's why I chose it for myself. I'm now going to ask Tim some of the harder questions about the referendum, the why and the how, which I think are much harder questions. And I'm going to sit down to do that because Tim's already sitting down. I'm hoping this is seamless transfer of microphones, which it was. Well done, Matt. So, Tim, under this umbrella of a broad question of why is this change to the Constitution being proposed, can I start with a broad question or a background question of where has this proposal come from and what has led to it?
Sure. Thank you for having me, everyone. Firstly, can I acknowledge the traditional owners of the country upon which we're located? I pay my respects to their ancestors who continue to inhabit the land, to the elders who continue to pass on stories of country, and to the younger generations who, with increasing vigour, fight for justice and equity for all of their mob. I do that as a Yuin person. Yuin country goes from about Ulladulla down to Eden and the Great Dividing Range to the ocean. My grandfather grew up on a Christian mission at Wallaga Lake, for those of you that know that area. It's near Bermagui, which, at least in my conversations, is as far north as any Victorian was willing to go into New South Wales. My grandmother was a Wiradjuri woman, though, so I have connections to that country, which is in central New South Wales. So to return to the question, there's really a long story and a short story. I'll start with the short story first. For those of you that might remember, Julia Gillard, when she was Prime Minister, as part of her agreement with various crossbenchers and the Greens after the 2010 election, agreed to set up an expert panel to investigate and report on constitutional recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. This was a campaign promise that John Howard took to his last election in 2007, and so it had been bubbling along as a conversation piece on both sides of politics for a number of years. The expert panel that Julia Gillard set up, which was co-chaired by now Senator Patrick Dodson, before he was a senator, and Mark Liebler, one of the partners here in Melbourne at Arnold Block Liebler, did a number of consultations around the country about what the form of constitutional recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders might be. Now, they made recommendations around the deletion of the races clause, the races power, which Michael discussed, and replacement with a special power for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And at the same time, in an effort to control the use of that power, to implement a racial non-discrimination clause, a clause of the Constitution that said Parliament could not pass laws that were racially discriminatory. So that was their proposal. Now, politics then got in the way of doing anything about it. The Gillard and then Rudd government never properly responded or never formally responded to the report, and there were concerns by the Abbott-led opposition about the idea of what was called a one-clause Bill of Rights, this idea of a right again, to be free of racial discrimination, and including that in the Constitution. So when Mr Abbott became Prime Minister, there was an attempt to break the deadlock. What are we going to do about this issue, this conversation about constitutional recognition? Because at that time, both parties were in favour of some form of constitutional recognition, but there had been a deadlock on what. And so Mr Abbott and Mr Shorten, the then opposition leader, agreed to set up a referendum council. And a referendum council was made up of various Indigenous and non-Indigenous people from all fields of life, law, politics, policy, health, education. And they went around the country and commenced another consultation process. But they particularly invested in what was called the regional dialogue process with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities themselves. If this was to be the aspiration of First Nations peoples, what was it that they wanted to see the change to be in the Constitution? And that regional dialogue process happened around the country and then culminated in the famous Uluru Convention in 2017, where 250 delegates from those regional dialogues met to decide what the ask would be. What, in the terms of the Uluru Statement, the invitation to the Australian people would be. And there were three pillars to the Uluru Statement: voice, treaty and truth. But the voice was the focus of the invitation, the request around constitutional change. So that's what really led us to this particular moment. Now, you're probably thinking, oh, Tim, that was the long story. Why did you call it the short story? Well, the long story is that the aspiration, the desire from First Nations communities for some sort of political representation in federal parliament or to federal parliament has been something that's been discussed since at least the 1920s. There's a really great piece by John Maynard, the Aboriginal historian at the University of Wollongong, about that. His grandfather, also called John Maynard, was president of the Aborigines Progressive Association in the 1920s. And they actually wrote a petition to attempt to have representation in Parliament and the creation of an advisory body which would be made up of both Indigenous and non-Indigenous people to advise Parliament on laws and policy. Then in the 1930s, you had the Day of Mourning, the first day of mourning in 1938, which slowly transformed to what we call NAIDOC Week, more of a celebration of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture. But that, the petition in 1938 also called for some form of constitutional change and some form of political representation for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. So there's always been a dual demand for some sort of political representation as well as constitutional change to recognise First Nations people. And that has continued to progress, and we've hit milestone moments in those movements. The 1967 referendum led to various advisory committees being set up by the Holt, the Gorton, the Whitlam, the Fraser, Hawke, Keating governments. And a variety of aspirations for further constitutional change, the Part 2 to 1967. So that's a bit of the background. I suppose the point is that whatever anyone ultimately decides about what they think of the voice, it hasn't come in a vacuum. And it wasn't an idea in Uluru by 250 people in 2017. It has a longer story than that.
Thanks, Tim. Then sort of branching out from that dimension of the why question and being a little more specific now about why this change, to ask a question, if you can say something about what problem is the change seeking to address?
So I think we all as Australians understand the intractable nature of the problems in Indigenous policy in this country. It's not controversial, sadly not controversial, to say that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders are amongst the most disadvantaged in the country. And I think everyone wants to fix that. Everyone wants that to no longer be a problem. Everyone wants there to be equality in the country, both of treatment and outcome. And so the question then is, well, how do we fix it? How do we fix the intractable nature of the problems that we face for our First Nations people? Now, there are going to be very specific policy solutions to various policy problems that occur for Indigenous peoples, whether it's in health, whether it's in education, whether it's in employment. But what we know is that a key ingredient to success, and we know this from monitoring and evaluation of programs here in Australia, monitoring and evaluation of successful programs overseas with other Indigenous peoples, we know one of the key ingredients is that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders are part of the process to design those policy positions and are able to input into those policy solutions. And so that's really where the idea for the voice comes from. If we know that Indigenous voices are key in order to get better at the policy solutions Parliament and the Executive design, then how do we set up an institutional framework by which those institutions can hear those voices? And that's the concept behind having the voice be able to make representations to Parliament and the Executive, to be able to feed in to a lot of those policy choices that are made at that level. And part of the problem has been that has been done in an extremely ad hoc and haphazard way throughout the course of history of the Commonwealth of Australia. And more often than not, it hasn't been done. So the idea is no longer to rely on the electoral cycle of the goodwill of particular governments, but to create some form of permanent institutional space by which Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders can direct their voices, in the language of the Constitutional Amendment, make representations to the Executive and the Parliament about the laws and policy that affects them.
Thanks, Tim. I'm going to, and just keeping an eye on the clock, so I'm going to bounce around in a little bit between why and how, but sort of trying to pick up on some of the things that you were saying. Turning to the sort of umbrella question of how will the voice operate in practice, do we actually know what the voice will look like in practice? Is there any guide to us at all as to what it's going to look like in practice?
Yeah, I mean, I'll give a typical lawyer answer, yes and no. So we know some things. So the Morrison government committed to a legislative form of the voice, but not a constitutional form of the voice. And so Tom Calma and Marcia Langton, two Aboriginal leaders, led a process of consultation around the country about what that would look like. And so they set up or made recommendations about having a national voice and regional voices below it, so that you had regional voices who could speak directly to shire councils, to state and territory governments, but could feed through their views to a national voice that would be able to speak directly to the federal parliament and the federal executive, the Prime Minister and Cabinet and all of the government departments. So they put together a report that let us know a little bit at least what they thought it looked like, and based on their consultations. And then in association with this particular proposal for the voice, that formed a real basis for a lot of the thinking around what the model might be. But to try to make it clearer for people, the referendum working group that was set up by the Prime Minister, which was made up of Indigenous leaders from around the country, put out some design principles which were endorsed at least by the current government. And those design principles for the voice include equal representation of men and women, direct election for representatives by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, to be financially and structurally independent from government as possible, and to be broadly representative of the geographical groupings of First Nations people around the country. So they put out some general design principles to give people an idea. But why I say no is that ultimately it'll be up to Parliament to determine the composition, powers and procedures of the body. That's exactly what the clause said. But that's in a way on purpose. As you said, the Constitution is really about frameworks. It's a place for principles, not policy detail. That it is in harmony with our constitutional design to leave some of those choices with Parliament. So yes, we don't exactly know what the voice will look like immediately if the vote is to implement the alteration to the Constitution, but we do know broadly the principles upon which it will be built, and we also know that in a way that level of detail that we have is on purpose.
I'm going to test you out by just bouncing around a little bit. Given what you've said about the history and the background that's led into it, and the concept of recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the Constitution, and also what you've said, though, about the problems and issues that the voice is seeking to address, what do you say how we should think about the body? To what extent is the creation, this proposal for the voice, a matter of symbolism and recognition in that sense, symbolic, and to what extent is it practical and functional?
I mean, it's a little bit of both, really. There are symbolic aspects of the proposal, the recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first peoples of Australia. That's really a symbolic recognition in our constitution of our first peoples. There's also a sense of symbolism in ensuring that there is a space for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voices to be heard, given the unfortunate history of our country where that has often not been the case. But there's a real practical nature to the proposal as well, and a lot of First Nations people who are in favour of the proposal, but also might have their concerns because it doesn't go far enough. There's a desire for there to be practical change on the ground for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities to deal with some of these intractable problems. So the desire for the voice in terms of its practicality is that it does make a difference in the minds of policymakers and in the minds of parliamentarians when they go to pass laws or make policy or design government programs, that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander representations will carry some sort of force that will then make those policy solutions and those laws better for the people on the ground that they're going to affect. So that's a real practical step that can ensure the wide variety of policy solutions that are being designed across multiple subject matters, that the voices of Indigenous people are able to make sure that Parliament and the government are as well informed about what will work on the ground as possible.
Let me pick up that last thought, because it's, I think it is a criticism that's made of the proposal, and a concern that a national body, which the voice will be, and which necessarily will have a limited number of members. We don't know how many, of course, because that's all to be designed. But whether and how a national body can be truly representative of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people from across Australia, and also, and the importance of being so representative, because of course, as you've alluded to, the issues facing First Nations people around the country differ, and certainly differ between remote communities, regional communities, and otherwise. But how would you answer the question, is it realistic to think that a national body of this kind can really be representative of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people?
Completely understand those concerns. I'd say a number of things. First of all, what you've just described could be said for our state parliament and for our federal parliament as well. I mean, we all elect this collection in Canberra of 152 people who represent their electorates and go to Canberra and do their business in Canberra, and have managed with varying degrees of success to survive for the past 120 odd years, without necessarily having the Australians having an existential crisis over its legitimacy. Now, some Australians might, but for the most part, most of us accept that system of democracy as representative of who we are, despite the fact we're a country of now 25 million people, with 150 people in Canberra making particular decisions associated with the operation of government. That's in the House of Representatives with 76 senators. So it's not foreign as a concept to have those types of representative bodies. A mentor of mine, Professor Mick Dodson, who was once Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Social Justice Commissioner, said, look, you're not going to fit us all in a room. There isn't a room big enough to figure out what we think. And in fact, as a community, we're going to disagree a lot of the time anyway. That's healthy, that's natural, that's any community. So building representative structures is a valid way to deal with that issue. I think, at least being Aboriginal, knowing my community, knowing and having worked with a lot of communities around the country, there is a depth of connection back to your community and a deep sense of responsibility for any of our leaders, for anyone who represents their community formally, to do so with seriousness and to do so only with the broad permission of their community, particularly elders and those with significant status. And so even if you have a national voice, if the referendum is successful, that's made up of representatives from around the country, there will be that deep sense of responsibility back home. And I think the only people that will be elected by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people will be people who can demonstrate that they can go back home and listen and explain to their community and take their community's views to Canberra, if that's to be the process. So, look, you know, I won't sit here and say there won't be risks. There won't be people who fail in their duties. There is a plethora of representatives in state and federal parliament that have failed in their duties over the course of history. But for the most part, and in the history of having Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander representative structures, for the most part, they've really achieved a lot through that, through both being connected to home, but being able to walk the halls of Parliament to be able to represent the views of community.
Thanks, Tim. Now, tonight we've promised questions and discussion, so now we're going to try and facilitate that, and I think Amy will probably lead us to invite questions from everyone who's here.
Hello. Yes, I'm also going to grab a chair before I ask the first question. So thank you to the team at the back who has been sending through these questions. Some of these are definitely a disclaimer because there's probably more questions than we have time for. But we have, I think the team at the back has been working really hard to rephrase some of the similar questions into one. And if there is time, I'm sure Tim and Michael can have a further chat with anyone else who might not get their questions answered. So we'll start off with this question and then I'll go and get a chair. How can the Voice represent the diversity of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders' views? I think you might have answered a little bit, but if you could clarify that.
Yeah, I think, I think through having diverse representation on the Voice itself, to make sure that there's broad geographical representation, to make sure that there's gender equality, which is one of the design principles for the Voice. So I think that's the nature of how we hope, if the referendum's successful, that the Voice will be designed to ensure that process occurs. There's also an open question about whether there might be regional voices created underneath a national voice. That's part of the Calma Langton report, and it's also one of the commitments from the opposition. Despite taking a formal no position in the referendum, they do have a policy commitment to legislate a national voice and regional voices. So to legislate for local and regional voices. So there's some sort of commitment, potentially on both sides, to invest in local bodies that will have even deeper knowledge to local communities.
Next question. There has been opposition to the Voice, and some have described it as divisive. How do you address this issue, or how do you think we should think about this?
Yeah, I think it's important to differentiate between whether the voice is divisive or the arguments about the voice are divisive. They're two different things. The voice itself is really not dividing us up by race, or I think the important thing to acknowledge, as Michael said in his opening remarks, is the unique nature of our First Peoples, the particular place of our First Peoples, and the unfortunate problems that are intractable, that are unique to First Nations persons because of the depth and width of those problems, is something that requires a unique solution and unique thinking. That's completely consistent with international human rights law, and it's just generally good practice. If there's a particular problem involving a particular community, then a particular solution needs to be hatched. And as I said before, we know that when First Nations people are involved in the design and delivery of programs and involved in the law-making process in some shape or form to be able to present their views, often you get a bit of product at the end of the day. That's really, that's in my view, not divisive. And in any event, there's no threat to anyone non-Indigenous about recognising the unique place and unique voice of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. The particular proposal is for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders to make representation on matters that affect them. So that's part of the power. It's about the voice being able to speak to the specific issues, the specific matters that affect Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. So there's nothing being taken away by anyone else in respect to that proposal. I think that's an important thing to remember.
So on that point, I think this next... Can you guys hear me okay? Yeah, okay. On that point, does the voice, and I think you've explained this already, but so will the voice have any input at all to other legislative or government decisions, in your view, based on the changes that will be made?
Yeah, look, it's a good question. The answer to this is both legal and practical. So legally, like I just said, the power of the voice in the Constitution is in a way limited to allow for the voice to make representations about matters affecting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So that's the universe in which it can act in many ways. So there would be a legal question of its power to go outside of that remit. Second thing is a practical matter. I've got enough to complain about an Aboriginal person, about what happens in terms of Aboriginal policy, than to worry about the plethora and expanse of policy in Australian politics. The voice is going to have to be clever, and the voice, I have no doubt, will be clever, because otherwise it will completely undermine its legitimacy if it doesn't focus on the most urgent issues facing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. One, that's going to be the demand of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities themselves. They're going to demand that their representatives actually make representations about the big ticket items, the issues that really affect them and their families, their kids, about school, about education policy, about health, about those things that make a day-to-day difference in the lives of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Second, Parliament and the Executive are going to expect it. If the voice suddenly starts to talk about peripheral issues, Parliament and the Executive is going to do what it has the constitutional right to do under the particular proposal, it's going to ignore all of those representations. Because we've got to remember, the representations aren't binding on Parliament or the executive. It's a power to make representations, but there's not an obligation to follow those representations on Parliament and the executive. It's an important part of the proposal. So at a practical level, the voice is going to have to really focus on those issues that deeply make a difference in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. And why wouldn't it? It's a shopping list of them.
I don't know if, Michael, you want to enter into the conversation or so. I will kind of direct a question that could be answered by either of you. So how likely is that the constitutionally entrenched voice will require a whole new level of bureaucracy that will make many lawyers rich?
Yeah.
I don't know what your thoughts are on that. Maybe just to lighten the mood a bit.
Look, I mean, the voice will require a group of people to make it work. So there is going to be a body, it's going to require staff, and there's going to be that as a practical matter. But ultimately, a whole new level of bureaucracy is probably, at least from my perspective, overdoing it. First of all, there are so many bureaucrats that work on Aboriginal policy in Canberra, in Melbourne, in Sydney, across the country, in various parts. A lot of that work is probably going to be folded in or no longer required by reason of the establishment of the voice. The voice itself is probably going to be pretty nimble and basic. One of the design principles that I forgot to mention that I think is pretty important and is implicit from the constitutional amendment is that the voice will not be involved in program delivery. Now that's the vast bulk of bureaucracy in Aboriginal affairs. It's in the delivery of services, specific health services, social services, all of those types of services to Aboriginal communities. It's the vast bulk of the bureaucracy in Indigenous affairs specifically. So that's not going to change. You're not going to, and the voice isn't going to require that type of bureaucracy to be built or behind it, because that's not its purpose. So we're thinking very different to those of you that remember ATSIC. ATSIC had dual responsibilities, the Australian and Torres Strait Islander Commission in the 80s and 90s. That was both a policy advocate and a service delivery model. Now, a lot of Aboriginal people have learnt from the problems that arose from having those dual responsibilities and have said, you know what, we'd prefer to hold government accountable to its program delivery rather than, as the voice, be in charge of that program delivery. The final point I'd make, well, with a short end note, but a final point I'd make is in terms of, I grew up in Canberra. The bureaucracy that works on Indigenous affairs is minute compared to the Defence Department. If you have a problem with bureaucracy, then have a think about how many people are employed in the Defence Department, how many people are employed in the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Most people that you wouldn't even know what they really do. A lot of, look, I say that without criticism, a lot of my friends who I grew up with in Canberra. But, you know, if the true concern is this multi-level bureaucracy, then you don't have to worry about the voice about that. The end note is I doubt many lawyers will make much money off of this.
I was going to take that hard, the hard question, the hard question about lawyers getting rich. Do I dare to go there? But I suspect what lies behind that question has been something that's been debated about the proposal as to whether it will whether the voice creates legal rights and will lead to litigation. I think that's the topic that's been there. No one like on any legal question, no one can provide a definitive answer to that question. However, I can say, and I think I can say quite confidently, many eminent former High Court judges have said that the concept that it will lead to a lot of litigation is nonsense. And the reason they say that is, as Tim mentioned before, because the language of the provision has been carefully chosen to refer to making representations, which has a certain connotation in the law and does not require the recipient of the representation to act upon the representation. And to suggest at law the recipient of the representation, Parliament or the executive government, has some sort of legal obligation as a result of the representation is just a very hard argument to make. That's not to say that some people don't make the argument. Lawyers are creative in the arguments that they make, and it's not to say that we may not see some test cases about the provision. It's like all changes to all laws or any constitution at any time. There is always an element, and I think it has to be accepted, an element of unpredictability. It's a question of what percentage element of unpredictability. And I must say, everything that I've read from former Chief Justices Bob French and Ken Hayne and other, Murray Gleeson, and so it goes, rates this risk as very low. And anyway, that provides me with assurance. Whether it provides you with assurance is obviously for you to judge.
And then this question is actually directed for you, Michael. The opposition to the voice states that the voice risks legal challenge and that the High Court would ultimately determine its powers. The person who asked this question wanted just your opinion or thoughts on this.
Oh, well, that's undoubtedly right, that the High Court, if called upon, ultimately determines the powers of the voice, both in terms of the meaning of the constitutional provision and the meaning of any laws that are created pursuant to that provision, as we saw. And as we saw, it's Parliament that has the power to make laws concerning the composition, functions, powers and procedures of the voice. So all matters of interpretation of both Section 120, the proposed Section 129 of the Constitution and laws made under it are ultimately determined by the courts in accordance with our system. And one would expect, if it was enacted, over the next 10 to 20 years, there would be a couple of cases to determine some points of detail and some areas of dispute about those laws. That wouldn't surprise me at all, but that's nothing more or less than happens with almost every other provision of the Constitution, which has been the subject of the litigation since the Constitution was first enacted. And of course, my daily life is filled with determining disputes about the meaning of Commonwealth laws. Really, 80% of what I do is determining disputes about the meaning of Commonwealth law. So that is the nature of our democracy. The courts do determine it. Generally, they determine it once and for all. And once it's ruled upon, particularly by the High Court, well, that's it. The High Court can change its mind over time, but does so rarely, and puts an end to litigation in that way. So, as I say, I don't think the fact that over time there might be some cases about, and I think particularly the law made pursuant to this provision, is really anything that would be surprising or different to every other law that's made under the Constitution.
Thank you for sharing that. Now, I am mindful of time, so we probably have another 7 minutes. So this question has been rephrased. How should we consider our views of the voice given the historical impacts of similar initiatives such as the National Aboriginal Consultative Committee established and decommissioned by the Whitlam government?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, what's going to make this different question. I think the difference in terms of the voice is that a lot of those previous representative structures that have been established have really risen and fallen at the whims of changes of government. So almost like clockwork, following a particular election, and particularly the election of a new government, of a new political party, there's been an abolition of whatever representative structure existed with a replacement of something that is said to be better. Now, that's not often at the request of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, or more generally the community. It's just often because a new government comes in and thinks it can do better. And that's typical of governments. That's not necessarily a criticism. That's a big part of the reason why we have changes of government. But that has led to real disruption in the stability of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander policy in the country, and a real sense of often in those cases throwing out the baby with the bathwater. So to use ATSIC as an example, that was a bipartisan decision to abolish ATSIC in around 2004 and 2005. That the problem is you had built up an organisation that had done whatever your feelings about some of the political leadership of ATSIC at the end, which was part of the controversy of why it was abolished, the institution itself had done a lot of good work in Indigenous policy, but also, interestingly, was only for a very short period in the 1980s responsible for Indigenous health and Indigenous education policy. Those are the two of the what I called the big ticket items. So even though ATSIC was only in charge of about 15% of Indigenous funding, it was really blamed for 85% of the problem a lot of the time, when in fact it was the general bureaucracy that was in charge of really big areas of policy. So by dissolving ATSIC and taking a long time to replace it, you just had a gap in where government was getting advice from, and you've had consistent gaps in the past, and we've had a significant gap for the past 10 to 15 years. And so that is part of the problem that the voice, by being constitutionalised, is trying to fix. If you create a permanent institutional framework in the Constitution, then you can start to build the type of legitimacy, credibility and momentum behind an institution that can make a difference, but at the same time have the flexibility through Parliament's power to pass laws around the composition and procedures to tweak as we go. Times will change. The nature of the voice is likely to change if it's passed over the next 20, 30, 40 years. It will, so what we talk about the voice now might be different to what we need in terms of the design of it in the future, particularly if it's successful. So I think that kind of balance between permanency and flexibility is something that the voice proposal is attempting to achieve.
So I have the go-ahead from Adam that if we want to go to 9 o'clock, we can, if that's okay with the both of you.
Yeah.
So kind of going back to something you covered at the beginning, why wasn't a constitutional convention held in the lead up to the referendum? Or why wasn't it for some, I think, the general public, it just felt like it just happened and we're doing this now?
Yeah, look, and I'm sympathetic to that view. What I would say is that not every constitutional amendment that has been proposed, and there's been 44, has gone to a constitutional convention. So it's not necessarily the done thing whenever we've proposed changes to the Constitution. It was done prior to the Republic referendum. So I think that's what the question is leading to. That is probably, in most people's living memory, the referendum they think about when they think about referenda. And it's the latest one that we had, and so is the most recent. And there was a constitutional convention to propose the change at that point. Look, I think it didn't happen for a number of reasons in this circumstance, whether you want to judge these reasons as right or wrong. First, even though there was a constitutional convention prior to the Republican referendum, and despite it coming up with a proposal that was eventually put to the people, there was a huge amount. It set the foundation for the ultimate split in the Republican groupings between direct electionists and government appointees, and really was a pretty hostile atmosphere, despite ultimately coming up with the proposal. So it kind of set the tone for the debate in many ways. So I think there might have been a feeling as though that might not necessarily be what we think it would achieve, knowing from history how it worked in the late 1990s. The other issue is that there was a long deliberative process and multiple consultation mechanisms involved throughout a period of time from the expert panel onwards that talked about a lot of these things with various communities, not only Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. And representative structures were often discussed throughout the course of those consultations. So there has been a process, at least, that has gone through. And then the final thing I'd say is that I think, and we know this from polling, in fact, most non-Indigenous Australians are not going to trust and will vote no to something that doesn't have majority Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander support. Because rightfully so, anyone will say, well, what's the point? What's the point of changing our constitution to invest in something that doesn't have the support of First Nations communities? So even though you will never get 100% support, the regional dialogue process and the Uluru Convention was an attempt to see what rose to the top for a lot of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in order to understand how that might be put. Because remember, the voice is something that will benefit us all as Australians ultimately, because if it works, if it's passed and if it works, the desire is that we start to see a change in some of those outcomes in terms of Indigenous disadvantage. If it didn't meet the aspirations for the very communities it was supposed to serve, First Nations people, then what was the point? Even if you had a convention of Australia, of representative of everyone, we would be 3% of the people. So ultimately, it's the aspirations of First Nations people that is at the heart of the proposal. And I think a lot of non-Indigenous people would say if it didn't meet those aspirations, then there's not much point in attempting to pursue it.
Thank you, Tim. Under the Voice proposal, will everyone who identifies as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders get to vote on who represents them in the Voice committee? And if not, that is a huge deal. So who exactly gets to appoint these representatives?
Yeah, look, I think the intent and arguably the notion of an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice will be that the voice will be made up of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and those peoples will be chosen by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. I don't think there'd be many people who would say that it would. I think even people who are in the no camp would say that it shouldn't be the case if the voice gets up, that's who elects those people.
So this might be a question that many Australians might have as well. And this person says, I'm an Australian and I have a voice to to Parliament by way of my local member of Parliament. Every Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander is also an Australian and has equal access, you can decide that or not, to have their local MP and therefore a voice in Parliament. There are dozens of government departments, agencies, local, state, federal, specifically set up to assist Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. So what can this proposal do that the dozens of departments and agencies haven't been able to achieve or are willing to achieve?
Well, look, I would love to be able to say that that's worked in practice, but we just know from the numbers it hasn't. We know from the intractable nature of the problem of Indigenous disadvantage that the typical methods of political advocacy and political representation haven't worked. And so you've got to think outside the box a little bit to be able to fix the problems. There might be some form of equal access on paper, but it hasn't happened in practice for Aboriginal people. There's a sense of voicelessness for a lot of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. Parliament has not been particularly representative of our communities or our views. And so there's a desire to have a space where those views can be directly given through our own representative structures to Parliament and to the executive. And that doesn't take away the place of those bureaucracies that work in Indigenous affairs, or Parliament or executive, or the idea of how parliamentarians might relate to their constituents. If anything, it's an enhancement to that system because it allows a particular space for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders to be able to directly speak to power in terms of the matters that directly affect them. And so that's the very concept. And again, that doesn't take anything away from anyone else. That doesn't mean that because a metaphorical door opens that another shuts to all non-Indigenous people in the country. If anything, it just opens another door by which parliamentarians take good advice. And it's on the basis that that hasn't happened well in history and needs to happen better to be able to make those types of changes that are needed. So that's the design behind it. It's an elevation rather than a trade-off.
Thanks, Tim. And we're on 9 o'clock, so we'll finish with one more question, and then there'll be a bit of housekeeping that I've been asked to announce. If the Parliament, if the Parliament is responsible for the composition of the voice as proposed in Part 3 of the amendment, are there any protections that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples will retain in terms of their rights to their representation? For example, how are the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people being enabled by this amendment to determine who is part of the voice?
Look, that's a really good question. A lot of that will be up to Parliament to determine rather than Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples themselves. So it is right to say that Parliament will set the rules essentially for the composition of the voice. Even though the fact that it's called an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice probably assumes that it will be made up of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as a matter of definition. But in terms of how those members are chosen, how many, those types of things, it will be a question for Parliament. I think if the vote is successful, there'll be moral force for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders to have a big part to play in designing the voice and how it works. So I think that will have an impact and will ensure that some of those concerns are addressed to make sure that it's truly representative and that all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have the best chance to elect their own representatives or select their own representatives, however they might choose to do it. So I think there's a small risk that that Parliament will get that wrong, but I don't think it's a particularly large one, given the momentum behind the creation of the voice if the referendum is successful.
And on that note, we've come to the end of our evening. Can you all join me in thanking Tim and Michael for their time? And we also have Melanie, who I think is also going to share something at the end.
Thank you. Yes, I'd just like to thank our guests tonight, Michael and Amy and Tim, for coming along and addressing us tonight. A very important question for us all to consider, and I think you've brought a lot of clarity and help for us all as we consider this. I'd like to close in prayer now, if you'd join me. Father, Lord, all history is yours. You hold each one of us in your great plan. We thank you for this land that we all call home, for its great beauty and riches that abound and are here for us to share. We thank you for the democratic system of government that we enjoy and the right to vote and the freedom of speech. Lord, we thank you for this referendum question. Please give us wisdom and discernment. Guide us to examine our hearts and prayerfully consider this important proposal. Lord, we pray also for a just outcome and that the result will be accepted broadly. And Lord, I pray for wisdom of our leaders and our administrators in delivering the outcomes. Lord, your blessings on our country and on its people. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you.
Thank you, Melanie. And just the final housekeeping from Adam at the back. If people could help with stacking some of the chairs to the side before you leave, that would be great, as I think there's an event here tomorrow. So thank you, everyone, and you are dismissed. And if you want to have some further discussion time, I think Tim and Michael will be at the front. So thank you.